Thank you very much for coming. I know it's the last session of the day, so I really appreciate, and it's a great attendance. So because we actually work hard for that presentation, and we're happy to share it with you. With that, let's start. And the name is Leverage Its Full Potential, and the reason is we will try to actually talk about things that we mentioned earlier, but actually didn't explain well enough, or didn't drill down enough. So with that, and yes, I will introduce us a little bit later. So please take some time to read the disclaimer. It's very important that you read it and understand it, right? Just I'll take a couple of seconds. So our agenda, right? So first we'll start with quick overview, and I bet you could tell me more about HA than I could tell you, but we'll still have a couple of slides just to get the party started, right? Then the action will happen, right? So we'll talk actually about 3 big use cases, and we'll discuss configuration in details, and we'll also talk about best practices. And I know that best practice is the best part of every session we've done so far, right? Awesome. So then we will actually run a quick survey, just 3 very simple questions. We would like your feedback. We obviously don't build HA for ourselves, we'll actually build it for you, and that's a great opportunity for you to help us to help you, right? And then we'll try to reserve as much time as possible for Q&A. And please keep your questions for the final part, so we could finish everything. And it should be enough. We plan for at least 10-15 minutes. So, and again, I'll mention at the end, but again, for questions, just come to the microphone so everyone hears the question and will hear our answer. What do you think? Let's start? Okay, great. So speakers, right? Alap is a senior engineer who has been working on HA. I'm a product manager for HA, right? That's just 2 of us. I think they match us, right? The pictures. Yeah. Overview, right? That's what I said. And again, well, first let's start with a show of hands. How many of you do use HA and have it enabled in your cluster? Say aye. Perfect. This is the best encouragement for us. Come on. So just a quick recap. Of course, you know what it is. It's a cluster-based feature, right? And obviously, we actually monitor hosts' heartbeats. We actually monitor hosts to make sure that we know their health. And in case a host fails, we actually restart your VM to protect your workloads, right? Very simple. Just mention here that we use a couple of networks to do, and you will see, we will actually talk about vSAN later on. That's why we mentioned, so either HA leverages management network or vSAN network. And it's important to understand the difference, and Alap will talk about that in details. So benefits, right? So we are here for benefits, right? So we always want to know what's in it for me, right? And I'm sure you know the main thing is HA helps you to minimize the unplanned downtime, right? And the beauty of it is you just enable it, it's there, you enable it, and it will take care of it automatically. So like we're constantly working on defaults, so defaults will do in many of the cases, right? Especially if you're starting with HA. Then again, the recovery is in minutes. It's very fast, it's not hours, and vSphere HA, it's one of the best solutions in the industry, if not the best, right? And obviously you know that very well. Another thing is just to recap what we protect against, right? So it's infrastructure, failures, connectivity, and application. And we will talk today specifically about applications. So it's easy to configure, and I would clarify, it's easy to enable and start using. That's true. Configuration might get a little bit trickier if you start using very advanced features and properties, right? And another one is it's as an application agnostic, right? So it doesn't matter what workloads you run, HA will help you, right? With that, let's move to another section. And the section is called HA in action. And so, as I mentioned, we'll talk about use cases, then we'll talk about configuration, then we'll talk about best practices. But to make sure that we actually explain everything well, we actually prepared some action, and I think I call it HA theater. So we'll play roles, right? So I will play a role, obviously, somebody who is new to HA. And Alap will play Alap. He's an expert in HA, right? Very simple. So with that, let's start. Hi, Alap.
Hey, Roman.
How you doing?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing well. Though I started using HA. I've learned about it, and it's a great feature. But I still need a lot of clarifications. And would you be able to help me?
Absolutely.
Great. So let me start with what I have right now. So I have application, and that application actually has two parts in it, two tiers, right? So the first one is database server, and the second one is web server. And as you could understand, I have dependencies. So I actually, don't want my web server to start unless my DB server is up and running.
Okay.
Right? And I'm thinking, is there anything that HA could help me with in this situation?
Absolutely. I mean, we have this wonderful capability called orchestrated restart. I think that provides exactly what you're looking for.
Interesting.
So,
can you tell me more?
Absolutely. So you mentioned that you had this dependency between the database VM and the web server VM, and you wanted the database VM to start up first. And then did you want the web server to start up, let's say if the database server does not start up for any reason?
No, I actually want to make sure that my DB server is up and running.
Okay, sounds good. So HA offers you this feature called restart orchestration. And there's two ways that you can define dependencies. So these two ways are, like one of them is the soft dependency and the other one is called the hard dependency. As you can see, with the soft dependency, we have these 5 levels of restart tiers from highest to lowest. What a soft dependency means is that if my database server is the first VM that should be failed over before I start my web server, if you implement a soft dependency between these two VMs, then HA will try its best to restart the database server. If for some reason it cannot restart the database server, it'll just move on to the web server. What a hard dependency means that the database server, HA will try to restart the database server. If it cannot restart the database server, it will not restart the web server. That's what we define as a hard dependency.
Interesting. So tell me, now I see that there is soft dependencies, there are hard dependencies.
Right.
How do they both work together?
So just one note that I wanted to make before we move on to that question is that we have 5 levels of restart tiers, and then you can basically place all your VMs into each of these restart tiers. So let's say if you place a bunch of VM in the highest priority tier, you might have the second bunch of VMs that you might place in the high priority tier. In case of a host failure or a VM failure, what HA does is it picks the first tier, in this case it's the highest priority tier, fails over all VMs in that tier, tries its best to fail over all VMs. If certain VMs cannot be failed over, it'll wait until the configured timeout, and then it'll move on to the next tier. And then it'll do the same thing for all the VMs in the next tier. And then once it's done with the high priority, it'll move to the medium, and so on and so forth until it reaches the lowest priority. Now coming back to your question, what is the link between these two dependencies? Like, how would one visualize these two dependencies when you're configuring it on your HA clusters? So here's a restart order model that will kind of help you to visualize how these dependencies play out or work with each other. As you can see, we have 5 tiers of restart levels. The first one being the highest, and the last one being the lowest priority. This one is the restart disabled tier. For those of you who already are using that, you can configure certain VMs to be restart disabled VMs. What this means is that HA just doesn't care about these and it won't restart these VMs in case of a host failure. So let's ignore that for now. Let's just focus on these 5 tiers. So as you can see, you can place VMs within the tiers, and you see the dotted lines here. These are the soft dependencies that we talked about in the previous slide. So HA will try to restart all VMs in tier 1. If it, for some worst case scenario, cannot fail over 1 or 2 VMs in that tier, it'll time out based on the configured value that is in your hands. And then it'll move on to the next tier and so on and so forth. The hard lines that you see right here, and right here, and right here, and right here, all of those are hard dependencies that you can create through VM and host groups that we saw in the earlier slide. These hard dependencies are hard because in this case, let's say, Roman, if this VM were to be your database server VM and this VM were to be your web server VM, HA will try its best to restart the database server VM, but if you have a hard dependency between these 2 VMs, it will not restart the web server because you have defined a hard dependency.
Okay. What if I place my database server in the second tier, which is lower priority than my actual web server? What is going to happen in this case?
That's actually a good question. So what you have done now is that you have defined a dependency between your database server and web server, saying that, hey, my database server should start before my web server. So you've created a hard dependency rule, but now you're placing the database VM in the next tier, which is lower in priority than the tier that the web server is in. HA does not allow you to do that. The moment you try to do that, it'll throw a configuration warning saying that you're creating a cyclic dependency which cannot be respected. So either you go and change the hard dependency, or you move the web server VM in the same tier as the database server.
Is this because it actually creates a conflict?
Yes, it creates a conflict.
The first VM, but it's in the lower tier. So,
exactly.
Okay, now I see.
You're perfectly right. So I hope that answers your
Yeah, that definitely
questions.
clarifies my question.
So let's just move on to the configuration steps on how you would achieve this, like through the HA UX page. So these are the steps that you would need to execute in order to configure restart orchestration for your VMs. I would like to bring your attention to step number 3 and 7, which are kind of special steps. Step 3 is the decision-making step where you actually have to think about these dependencies and define dependencies. I think, Roman, you've already done that. You're clear on that part. You have a dependency on your database server and between your web server and database server. The 7th point is optional. You can define VM overrides for VM's restart priorities and place them in different restart tiers, but that's a completely optional step.
Okay.
And yeah, once you do this, orchestrated restart will automatically take care of the restart order. So as you can see here, so this is the first thing that you see when you open the HA configuration page on your cluster configuration setting. So once you enable HA, within the failures and responses tab, you just select the failure response to restart VMs because you would want these VMs to get restarted. That's the basic failure response that you would desire. As you can note here, this is the default VM restart priority for the entire cluster, which has been set to medium. Now, Roman, remember we talked about these 5 different restart tiers from highest to lowest.
Highest, high, medium,
low, and lowest.
Yes.
So by default, the cluster restart priority for all VMs is set to medium.
So that's in the middle, right?
It's in the middle. It's the third tier.
That works for me.
Right. And once you configure that, if you're free to change that if you want.
Okay.
Once you do that, then you move on to the second step, which is setting VM dependency restart conditions.
And before you go there, can you just talk a little bit, what is VM dependency?
Sure. So let's say you have your database server and you want that to start up first, right? But when should HA move on to starting the web server VM? should HA wait for the database server to power on, or should it wait until the guest operating system has booted up, or should it wait until the database server application comes up successfully?
Okay. Very interesting.
So these are like these are like different VM dependency restart conditions.
And is this something I do at the cluster level or per VM?
You can definitely do it at both. You can set the cluster level default that applies to all VMs. Okay. And then you can also configure it on a per VM basis.
Okay, thank you.
So the best practices for setting the VM dependency restart condition, it actually depends upon your use case. So if in your case, Roman, I think you're more interested in the application coming up and not just either resource allocation for that VM or not just like powering on the VM.
Yeah, I want to make sure that my DB server is up and running before I actually I go to a web server.
Makes sense. So in that case, the setting that I would recommend for you is the fourth one, which is application heartbeats detected. And as you can see, HA will make sure that it receives application heartbeats from the database server VM. Once it verifies that yes, the heartbeats are green, that the database server has started up, it'll then move on to restarting the web server. It won't move on to the web server if it does not receive app heartbeats.
Okay, sounds good.
And the next step here is that, so step 3, if you remember correctly, the step 3 was the defining the dependency step, which I think you've already taken care of.
Yeah, I clearly understand that. First, I need my DB server.
Perfect.
And only afterwards, web server.
Makes sense. So the next step then would be to create 2 different VM groups. So if you go to the VM and VM host group page, you just create a new group. I've just named it database group, and I've placed my database VM within this group. I've created a web server group. I've placed my web server VM within this group. Now you can add multiple VMs within the same group as well. But for this particular use case, we just have 2 VMs. So we just have 1 VM in each group.
Where is this option? So I see this create VM host group, and I can recall if I saw it in HA configuration.
It is actually, that's a good question. It's not in the HA configuration because you can define groups for other features as well, but it's actually part of the general cluster configuration page.
Okay,
it's on the left side of the, it's on the left pane of the cluster level settings.
Okay.
Yeah. So once you have done that, then we finally arrive at the last step. Now that we have defined 2 groups, the database server group and the web server group, all we need to do is define a rule between them, the dependency between them. So what this means is that I'll create a VM host rule, and the type of this rule is VM to VM, since I want my DB VM to start up before my web server VM. And as you can see here, you can select from the list of available groups, and I've configured this in such a way that VMs in the cluster VM group database group must have the dependency restart condition met before HA proceeds to restarting the web server VMs.
Just to make sure that I understand. So at the previous step, we created 2 groups, right? Mm-hmm. And in every group, we actually, so my DB server is 1 group, right? And that group only has just 1 VM.
Correct.
And in another group, which is web server group, it's also only 1 VM, right?
Right.
Which is, so basically the groups now represent my VMs.
Yes.
And that's how you select one of the groups and say one of them is kind of the main one, the other one is dependent.
Correct.
Right? Okay.
Yes, that's true. You can also add more VMs to these groups.
Okay.
That way you don't have to create 1 group per VM. So you can group a bunch of VMs together. If you have a bunch of database servers that you want to boot up first, that you want HA to fail over first, before HA fails over the web server VMs, you can place all those DB servers in that group and create a dependency across the web server VMs.
Yeah, it will definitely be useful later on. Now
right.
Just trying and see how it works.
Makes sense. Now we go to the next step, which is the optional step, which you might want to do. So remember the restart tiers that we talked about. So by default, you have placed both these VMs in the medium tier, which is right in the middle. But let's say you have a lot more VMs in the cluster and you want this pair of VMs or just the database server VM to start up first.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I actually, so that DB server I'm talking about, that's very important. So I want to actually change it, put it maybe a higher priority.
So in that case, I definitely recommend that you go to the VM overrides group page, the VM overrides configuration setting. You select the database VM and you can override the default restart priority, which was medium, which we had configured at the cluster level, and you can change it to highest.
And this is this also at cluster level?
This is also at the cluster level. Yes, that's correct. So I think that pretty much takes care of all the configuration, and restart orchestration will now work as expected.
Any other things I should be aware of before I start using orchestrated restart?
Yes, there are a couple of points that I actually wanted to bring to everyone's attention. So let's say if you have VM B, which is dependent on VM A, if A fails sore and if B is running completely fine, then this feature does not go and restart B, because B has not failed. It's running completely fine. So that is one thing. The second point I wanted to bring to your attention is that only direct dependencies are respected. So let's say if you create a long chain of dependent VMs, where you have VMC, which is dependent upon VMB, and VMB, which is dependent upon VMA. If A and C fail, then they will be restarted in parallel. Like C will not wait for A to have its readiness condition met, because there's no direct dependency between C and A.
Okay, so then what should I do in this case?
I mean, it's actually very simple. If you actually want to have a dependency between C and A, you just go and create another rule.
Okay. So that means, so if I have, at the moment, if I have a chain, then I have to create different combinations of VMs in that chain, basically recreate the chain with these pairs.
Absolutely.
Okay.
That's right. And the third point is that, so HA has different kinds of failure responses. Majority of the cases, the failure response is to restart VMs. But there are certain cases and certain features where the failure response is not to restart a VM, but to reset a VM in place. So if you don't have a host failure, let's say you have enabled VM and application monitoring and the guest OS crashed on that VM. So in that case, the remediation action or the failure response is to just reset the VM in place. So all the reset operations, wherever you have set the failure response to reset instead of restart VMs, all of those operations will not be orchestrated.
So you say if this, and when do these reset operations happen? So you mentioned it's when VM monitoring?
Yes, so if you enable and VMCP's APD timeout, so if you have storage disconnectivity issues, if you have configured VMCP for HA, and the failure response has been set to reset VMs, then that operation is also not orchestrated.
I will definitely keep this in mind.
Cool.
Yes, another question. Thank you very much. It looks like it's definitely the capability orchestrated restart is something that perfectly matches my use case and would definitely will help me. But what I also have, the concern I have, so as I mentioned, my DB server is very important, right? And I wonder if there is anything that could help me to protect any crashes of the DB server, maybe something that also, any failures that are coming from operating system as well?
Sure, I mean, there's this tried and tested feature called VM and application monitoring. By default, it is not enabled on the HA cluster configuration, but you can go and enable it.
Oh, okay. That's probably why I actually haven't used it or haven't seen it.
Yeah, you should definitely try it out.
Can you explain more how it works?
Sure. So let me just go over what actually VM and application monitoring is. So you mentioned that you have a Windows server running a database instance, a database application. What VM monitoring does is that it monitors the guest heartbeats once you enable VM and app monitoring. And if it detects that the heartbeats are not coming through or there's something wrong with the guest OS, then it will actually go and reset the VM in place. So I'm pretty sure that you're using VMware tools. for your Windows server. Yeah, so it's absolutely recommended to install the latest and greatest VMware tools. Once you install it and once you enable this feature, HA starts monitoring VMware tools heartbeats and the storage and the network I/O that is being performed by that VM. In this case, let's say if there's a guest operating system crash, if the guest operating system crashed, which means that your application is no longer running on the VM, HA will restart that particular VM if it detects red VMware tool heartbeats, and at the same time it detects that the VM is not generating any storage or network I/O, as that's a short confirmation that the VM has gone down. There's something wrong that's happened with the guest operating system. The second aspect is that, let's say if you do not have any operating system failures, but if your database application itself fails, then how do you detect that? So for that, I recommend that you enable application monitoring. Now note that one of the prerequisites for enabling this feature is that the guest and HA application monitoring SDK needs to be installed within that VM.
Okay.
And what this allows you to do is that it allows you to provide monitoring hooks into the application that you desire. And on the other hand, it communicates the state of that application based on the script or the program that you have written to the vSphere HA infrastructure and to the distributed cluster that's running. And HA will monitor those application heartbeats and will restart a VM if it detects either red heartbeats or it detects the immediate reset command from the SDK.
So I like a lot application monitoring, but it feels like it's advanced feature. And you mentioned that I have to install SDK where?
You have to install the SDK within the VM. So you need
within every VM I have to enable application monitoring.
Yes. So all the VMs that you're interested in monitoring the applications for, you have to go and install.
So is there anything else I have to do?
The next step would be to write your own script or program to provide monitoring hooks into the application that you desire. Now there are two ways to do this.
Okay.
One is either you write your own script or program. We provide a lot of samples within this application monitoring SDK. We provide a lot of documentation for different platforms like Linux and Windows and so on and so forth. And then you can just either use the sample programs or you can write your own program. We provide sample code snippets as well. That's approach one. The second approach is that we do partner with we have partner solutions that can allow you to provide monitoring hooks into the applications that you desire. Symantec is one example.
Okay, sounds good. So yeah, I will definitely look into the samples. Is it hard to use them, to write this?
It's not at all hard. The documentation is very simple, and we provide really small code snippets and applications that you can use.
And yeah, I might also have to look into partner solution as well.
Sounds good. So let's just go over how you would configure VM and app monitoring. So this is the page that you would see. So this is again the failures and responses page that you had seen earlier. One of the options, one of the features, if you scroll down, is the VM monitoring feature. So there are three options. By default, it's disabled. You can enable VM monitoring only, or you can enable VM and application monitoring. So these are some of the settings that you would configure if you want to customize your environment for this feature.
So yeah, what do you recommend? So I see a lot of settings. So how do I decide what to start using with maybe?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's usually the first thing that you should start thinking about when you enable this feature. So the very first recommendation is that always use the latest VMware tools.
Yeah, we do it already. So
we have made a lot of significant improvements.
Okay.
The second recommendation is that usually the general recommended heartbeat monitoring sensitivity is preset low plus 24-hour window. So we offer these three sensitivity levels. What these translate into is how aggressive you want to be in monitoring, detecting, and remediating failures. If you have the lowest setting, then it means that you want to be super conservative. You want to wait for a certain time. Let HA make sure that yes, there has been a failure for the past X seconds before HA goes and restarts the VM.
Okay.
So depending upon your use case, yeah, I would recommend that you start off with the preset low sensitivity with a 24-hour window, and you can scale up and down based on your use case.
I'll definitely start slowly. I will go with low sensitivity and see how it actually what HA does to my VMs, and we'll see. I'll definitely readjust it to.
Cool. Sounds good. Just the third point that I wanted to bring to your attention is that there's a very cool sub feature to this, is that specifically for Windows VMs, HA is going to detect the guest OS crash for a Windows VM, and it will reset that VM immediately. So you don't have to configure any presets or any VM monitoring settings for that VM in case you run into a guest operating system crash. Note that for this particular feature, you have a very powerful advanced option called dash.wait for dump on GOS crash that will allow you to customize the behavior that's more suited for your environment. So, I mean, as you probably already know, when a cold dump occurs on a guest operating system, if you are cold dumping over the network, it might take 1 hour, it might take 2 hours, or it might get over in like 2 minutes, depending upon your setup and environment. By default, this option is set to true. What this means is that HA will reset a VM only after the cold dump has completed successfully. But let's say you don't want to wait for a cold dump. I mean, in case it's going to take like 2 hours, you might want a faster recovery time, and you might want HA to reset the VM as soon as possible. Then we recommend that you set this option to false, and HA will immediately reset the VM.
Yeah, I'll definitely do this. It sounds like a good one.
Cool.
So Alap, thank you very much. So VM and application monitoring looks like a very useful capability in my case. And I will research and I will follow your recommendations, use preset low, and we'll start there. But what I also want to do, I plan to leverage vSAN with my vSphere. And obviously I love HA, so I want to enable HA for this environment. I wonder if I have to do anything to actually adjust HA somehow for vSAN.
I don't think so. I mean, HA practically works out of the box with vSAN.
Sounds good.
There's a few settings or a few best practice configuration that you might want to be aware of to customize your environment better for vSAN.
Can you tell me more?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. So here are certain guidelines that you might find useful.
Okay.
So as you already know, on a non-vSAN cluster, HA uses the management network to communicate the availability of hosts. With vSAN, HA is going to use only the vSAN network to communicate the availability. So the management network is out of the picture. The second guideline is for heartbeat data stores. So for a traditional cluster, like a non-vSAN cluster, you can pretty much configure any traditional shared data store as the heartbeat data store. That still holds true for vSAN, but the only difference is that you cannot configure a vSAN data store as the heartbeat data store. You still need to use a traditional data store as the heartbeat data store.
And why is that the case?
So vSAN is actually, I mean, as you probably already know, vSAN is a distributed object store. So when in cases of like network partitions and host isolations, each host is going to have a different view of the distributed objects. And we don't want different views in case of network partitions. We want the actual view to be exact on both sides of the partitions. So if you have a traditional data store, that will allow you to see the entire cluster and the similar views on both sides of the partition.
Makes sense.
Cool. And the last guideline is for host isolation. I mean, as many of you already know, HA is going to mark a host as isolated when A, the host cannot ping any of its isolation addresses, and B, when the management network is inaccessible. Now note that this still holds for the non-vSAN case. For vSAN, this is pretty much true as well, with a slight difference. The difference is that since the management network is out of the picture, HA is going to check whether the vSAN network is inaccessible or not. and also check the isolation addresses that you have configured.
I see the differences. Yeah, it definitely helps to understand.
Cool. And continuing on those same lines, there's certain best practices when you enable HA on vSAN. The first one is for Heartbeat data stores. So I recommend that you add a non-vSAN Heartbeat data store to the HA cluster if you want to prevent VM MAC address collisions on your VM network.
So tell me a little bit more about what is this VM MAC collisions thing.
So in case you have a partition in your vSAN cluster, and let's say you have VMs running on one side of the partition, if you do not have Heartbeat data stores, then HA is going to restart those VMs if they have sufficient quorum onto the other partition. So you might end up with a situation where you have the split brain scenario where you might have two copies of the same VM running on each side of the partition. If you, however, configure a Heartbeat data store, you can prevent that.
Yeah, I definitely want to prevent that situation.
On those same lines, just make sure that the Heartbeat data store that you configure is fault isolated from the vSAN network. I mean, just make sure that it's on a different network than the vSAN network, because when the vSAN network gets partitioned, you want to make sure that the Heartbeat data store can access both sides of the partition to get the correct views.
Sounds good.
Yeah, that's it for Heartbeat data stores. The second best practice is for host isolation. So remember how we talked that vSAN clusters use vSAN, like HA uses the vSAN network for vSAN clusters. With this in mind, use the default gateways of the vSAN network as your isolation addresses. The way to do this is through this two-step process. The first step that you would need to execute is that you would need to set the advanced HA option dash.use default isolation address to false, because once you set this, it is going to prevent HA from using any of the management network gateways, and you don't want that for a vSAN network. You want to use gateways which are on the vSAN network. And the second step is to set isolation addresses via the HA advanced option dash.isolation address X, where X ranges from 0 to 9. This means that you can configure a total of 10 isolation addresses. If HA cannot ping all of them, only then will it mark that host as isolated. If the HA agent on that host can ping any one of these isolation addresses, then the host will not be marked as isolated. So yeah, you would need to configure this and set your vSAN default gateways on your vSAN network as your isolation addresses. And a good segue into that is into the next recommendation that we have, that if you expect partitions and isolations, then at least ensure that one set of isolation address is accessible during a vSAN network partition.
Thank you a lot. That was definitely useful, and I will keep in mind all the recommendations once I go through the.
Cool.
Thank you very much.
Good. Thank you.
I'll go and start configuring.
Absolutely, yeah.
Thank you, colleagues. So that actually concludes the action part of the presentation. So I hope you liked it, and I hope it was actually useful. Thank you very much. So as I mentioned, remember in agenda we had this survey. So yeah, don't leave yet. So this survey will be also useful for you, just to kind of give your ideas of what we are thinking about, right? So, and we are researching a lot of topics, and we just need your feedback, your help to help us, prioritize and at least to see if actually all of these ideas resonate with you well. So give me a second, I have to set up a survey.
And influence the direction of the product in the future as well.
Come on. All right. And
5.
I know. So I'll just, while it's loading, so the survey is interactive, and I'm sure you've seen it, so 5, right?
Yeah.
I'm sure you've seen it, that we use poll everywhere. So if you could please just pick up your phones. Oh, somebody already did. So, fast, so, and text to VM 2017 to the number 22333. So you will enter the survey participation and then just reply the A, B, C, and D. And just, so the question is the following. So, like, why, it's basically, why do you use HA? Why do you enable? Is there any specific thing that you focus, that you protect your VMs from, right? And it's either hardware failures, storage failures, networking failures, or as an example, so my concern in this theater was application, right, as well. And you see, yeah, we immediately get the results. So you see how actually, which issues your colleagues deal with, right? So yeah, hardware failures is the winner. Okay. Storage networking. I'll just give it a couple of minutes, and I think we're good in time, so we'll definitely have at least 10 minutes, maybe even more, for Q&A. So just let's wait a couple of more responses. Okay, yeah, we have a clear winner. Yeah, so, and definitely feel free in Q&A, which will be very soon, could just mention something about this. So let's move on to another question. So another question is, so by the way, yeah, it's flipped. So if you were replying to the previous one, so it's the same letters. So you could actually kind of cancel your answer and re-vote again. But it's actually probably the most disturbing for you. What are your HA pain points, right? And we tried to mention a couple of things we think are right, not just think, right? We talk with not all of you particularly, but we talk with many customers, right? So we actually know a lot what is happening. So we try to put things that we actually see and could have a significant impact from our perspective, right? And I see, so okay, long VM recovery time is not an issue. That's great. Decide on an ideal HA configuration. Okay. And, well, I guess it doesn't require explanation. So as I said, it's very simple to enable HA, right? And if you go with defaults, actually, you could already achieve a lot of success. But then later, you actually want to, you see what is happening. Sometimes it's not, like, defaults are not ideal for your environment. So you have to go and drill down. And what Alap showed, there are many things that you need to configure to make sure everything works, right? And that's why we do sessions like that, and we do blog posts, and we have documentation, right? But yeah, I definitely see it's something actually I don't know what to say. I didn't actually expect. I thought there might be some other issues, but potentially it's a good thing for us. So yep. It's also, it's a user experience issue, it's UI issue as well. So yeah, we're definitely researching and we're investigating a lot of ways how to improve the situation. Thank you. And the final one is your best wish, right? And why wish, right? So the difference here is that it's something that might not be bothering you right now. It's something might not be critical, but it's something that you want us, it's a direction where you would like us to go. It's something that you see, oh, it would be great, especially, I don't know, because the trends are falling, or like my scale is growing, or for some other reasons, you see that in the future you actually would like to have a specific set of things, right? Or at least a direction to go. And I think some of the points require explanation. So cross-cluster HA, right? Very simple, right? HA now operates within a cluster. So would you be actually interested for HA to take care and go beyond the cluster, right? The next option is actually, it's kind of expanding even more, right? So you have two vCenters. So obviously right now HA within cluster within vCenter. What do you think? Would that be useful? Do you see how actually you could leverage something like that? The third one is, I think, is the hardest to grasp, or maybe I think we spent tons of time to phrasing it. But in reality, what it is, so you know well, actually, yeah, this is per VM. I think, yeah, no, this one is not that hard to understand, right? So we have reservations, resource reservation per cluster. Would you actually like to have something reserved for particular VM? So let's say you have a VM or a couple of VMs that are extremely important and useful, and you would not start any other VMs and just put all the resources for that particular one, but guarantee that that VM is up and running, right? That's what option C represents. The option D is admission control based on VM runtime resource usage. So right now we have 3 policies, and say most of them, well, they heavily leverage reservations. And it's not that we are looking at actually runtimes of your VMs and how the resources are utilized. And therefore, what we are investigating and trying to see if that would be something useful, right? Because we see the trend, and the trend is obviously reservations are used less and less often. And therefore, we are also thinking, okay, what do we do next? How do we improve admissions control, right? So that's the D option. And again, VM component protection. So you know that we have that capability in HA for non-vSAN situations. So what do you think? Would that be useful once you have vSAN? And again, it also obviously depends on if you plan to adopt vSAN or if you are using vSAN right now. But those are the things, and I see, okay, cross-cluster HA is the winner. That's a good one. Yeah. So yeah, I'm sure many of you are interested in VMware Cloud on AWS. So that's, I guess you could, see some relevance. And we've done a lot of sessions, right, talking about how things gonna play out. So yeah, if you haven't checked VMware Cloud on AWS and what is actually happening in that area, so please do it. It's important. It's as you saw from the keynote. It's part of the global company vision. So definitely keep an eye on it. Even if it might not be in your immediate future, but it's definitely something very important and strategic, and not only for us, for you as well, right? Okay, thank you very much. So with that, let me switch back. Just a second. Okay. So very simple slide. Q&A, so we are open, and we have 10 minutes for questions. So please come to the microphone and ask your question.
Hi.
Is the mic working? It's on. Good.
One thing I have as an issue with HA, it works great, but the one thing I have as a consultant is I want to recommend that customers put on VM monitoring, but I always have, well, I shouldn't say always, it's a disconcerting amount of customers still have problems with it where it will false positive restart VMs even though I set it to low. I can't seem to figure out, these are VMs that are running, they're generating workload, they're generating network I/O, storage I/O, that kind of stuff. It's not across the environment that there's false positives, like a handful, but it's something then that I can't just recommend a customer turn it on. I have to say, if you're going to turn it on, you're going to have to watch everything and make sure that there's nothing being restarted. All your VM tools are updated. Even with the VM tools updated and everything, I can tell them that I know for sure that I can take care of. Doing all those things still results in, often enough, a handful of VMs in every environment that false positives seemingly are restarting. And I can't give an explanation as for why. I didn't know if that's a common problem that you guys hear, or what could I do about it other than set the sensitivity?
Yeah, I hear you. So what's the environment are we talking about? Is it 6.5 or is it 5.5?
5.5, 6.
Yeah,
right.
You could comment.
So with 6.5, we've made a lot of improvements, and we've improved upon. We've actually eliminated a lot of false positives. So a lot more work has gone into making VM monitoring a robust feature. So with the latest 6.5 VMware tools and the latest 6.5 VMware HA, you can expect a much better performance where you won't be seeing a lot of these false positives. Another reason why I can think of is, why they might be running into this situation is that, so as we talked about this earlier, right? So VM monitoring looks at the VM tools heartbeats. Now the VM tools heartbeats could be read because if the VM is under a lot of performance, a lot of load, let's say it's heavily contended, VMware tools heartbeats might also get a little flaky because it won't be able to ping outside to the infrastructure. In that case, we actually recommend that there's this advanced setting called dash.io stats intervals. The second step after HA monitors for VMware tools heartbeats is that it also looks at the storage and the network IO. So by default, the window for which it looks at this IO is set to 120 seconds. That's the default. But if you have a lot of VMs that are under contention, then you might want to increase this window, or if you're seeing a lot of false positives, you might want to increase this window to a bigger number. That means that is how far back in history HA looks at the IO stats to figure out whether this VM is actually working or not. So if you increase that time window, the average of that, even if there's like one single IO, HA will not reset the VM. So that might help, increasing the IO stats monitoring window. I'm sorry? It's an advanced option called dash.io stats interval.
Yeah, just check IO stats intervals, like just Google it.
If you just Google it, you'll get more update on that.
Thank you.
Thanks.
How's it going? I had two questions. One's real quick. The SDK, is that a separate install or just something that's in VMware Tools to enable?
It's actually a separately installed SDK, but it is available on the VMware website.
Okay. The other one, when you were doing the first use case and you had two VM groups, web and DB, in that instance, let's just say the DB has to start before the web. Does it, and you have, let's say, 3 VMs in each one, does it wait for all of the DBs to start the web, or can you say, VM D is already started, you can start VM A?
No, so that's the thing. Like as of now, you can define dependencies only between VM groups, not between VMs. So if you have too many of these intricate dependencies, you might have to create one group per VM.
Okay. I got one more. I saw you on the bottom it said to enable vSAN before turning on HA. What if you already have HA before you go into vSAN? Is it just disable HA and then?
Yeah, just disable HA and re-enable it back.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Sure.
Hey, so on that same database and web server implementation, I heard you talk about waiting for the database to actually start, but I noticed in the slides there wasn't any explanation of how that's configured. As far as does it use VMware Tools? Does it read a port number or something? Or
correct. So it goes back to the same application and guest HA and application monitoring SDK that you need to install in the guest, and it's the same way that you would enable application monitoring for that VM. So you install that SDK, you either use a partner program or you write your own custom script to provide monitoring hooks into that application. and then send out heartbeats that HA listens to.
So as a matter of fact, so if you remember, we had these dependencies listed, right? And where we like from drop down, and we also had tables with check marks, what is recommended. So everyone, so in documentation, everyone is explained, and even in the final one which we used, well, part of the explanation is you have to like use SDK.
Install the SDK first.
So just check the dependency, you'll be good on this stuff.
So maybe like a follow up to that is if you could make that easier for people, because like I engineer Vol here, and like we don't always have time to look at SDKs and stuff. If it was a simple like, hey, check a port number, is this port number up? It's really every application has a port number, right? And that'd be really simple. It seems like a simple thing to implement. So.
Yeah, that's a good feedback.
That's a good feedback. Yeah, we'll take that to consideration.
Hey, so you already answered whether or not you have this capability, but I'm wondering if maybe it's something you guys are looking at. As far as the orchestrated restarts and losing the DB and the app server being up, that's one of the reasons we don't have a lot of HA-enabled third-party applications that don't behave well when they lose their database servers. But because SQL, Oracle are so restrictive and expensive on their licensing, by default, almost all our workloads, at least in a small shop, the database loads are going to be on one or two hosts. The chances of me having an application or a web server on those same hosts are pretty much zero. So if I lose a database host, I'm back to manual everything. Whereas if you could say, I want a dependent restart based on these database servers coming back up, but you also need to hit these web servers or application servers with a reset, because they're not going to come back up on their own. Yeah,
we definitely hear you, and that was listed in the notes, right? Keep in mind, and we obviously know the gap and we see it, right? So we're considering different ways, and I have to say, so orchestrated restart has just been introduced with 6.5, right? So it's relatively new, and it's extremely powerful, right? But it's a very, I would say, it's a big thing where you have to configure many things, and it has like a lot of knobs. So there are certain things that we have to improve, absolutely.
Yeah,
and
but like
that's
I said,
one of them.
It's almost all the loads I would look at wanting to have a restart priority are the ones that are like that, though. And like I said, almost 100% of the time, they're not going to be on the same host that fails.
Yeah, makes sense. Any other questions? Sure, go for it.
Smart tiering. We use naming conventions for our VMs. It would really be nice for either the software part to have smart groups where it's like, okay, if I see this pattern, it automatically belongs here instead of having to set it per VM. Just a little extra orchestration.
But then you say it's going to be smart based on the names?
Yeah, like if the server name contains SQL, it's automatically high.
Okay. That's a nice one. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, we will definitely consider. And as you said, it's kind of in line with in general like being smart and intelligent. So I don't know if we had like some sessions related about talking about that, right? So yeah, I definitely see it. It fits very well in our vision, right? Global vision. Yeah. Thank you.
Sounds like tags may be better.
Yeah, I mean, just one way or the other, just one way of just helping to do a little bit of automatic orchestration. So I have to remember the settings.
Yeah.
The security groups that have that section to do it, or that either name or tags.
Okay, cool. Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the reference. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, definitely.
Will you take a question on fault tolerance?
No.
Okay.
Well, the reason is that I don't know much. I know something, but it's it's a different product team altogether. So
that's cool.
You should definitely better talk to them.
Okay.
Sorry for that. Any other HA questions?
With the VM monitoring, is there a possibility that you guys would be looking into maybe setting it like how DRS is set up, where you can have it, you could turn it on, but it would just tell you that, hey, I think I should reboot now. Is this okay? Just so you could put it on a production server and make sure that it doesn't do false positives on you, and you're like, okay, let me just watch and see what this does.
Either automatic or manual mode.
Just
kind
a
of a
warning,
thing.
right? So what you want is a warning, right?
Yeah, just to see. I want to see what's going to happen before I really let it go.
Okay.
Like a passive mode, so it'll set the flag saying, "Hey, I would have rebooted at this time."
Correct. Right.
Yeah.
That's a good point. Yep.
Well, yeah, we're out of time, so thank you very much
Thanks a lot.
for your questions, for your participation. Thank you.